Hi, everybody, and welcome. Today, I'm joined by Professor Neale O'Connor, who is a professor of accounting in Monash University. And I've met with him a number of times when he was in Hong Kong previously. And I've been following what he's been doing. He's been up to a lot of very interesting things, as you will see. And today, the main topic is going to be the role of factory audits in vetting suppliers, and what his new research tells us, and basically what buyers should really pay attention to, right? So, hello, Neale. So tell us a little bit about what you've been up to recently.
Hi, Renaud, and good to have everyone on the podcast. Thanks again. Yeah, just briefly, I used to like to tell my industry folk, and please don't get sidetracked by the fact that I'm a professor. I'm different from the ordinary professor. I grew up on a farm. I love making things. I write papers, academic papers that no one reads. And I've spent a lot of time, especially in the last decade, visiting factories in China, working with suppliers on behalf of clients from overseas. And I've actually gone in and done factory audits myself. So I've actually seen the challenges of what audits pose for buyers that are trying to manage their suppliers at a distance, Renaud. Yeah.
Right. Because I've been following what you've been doing for, I don't know, at least a dozen years, and you've always been sort of involved in, manufacturing in China. What's going on? What are the challenges and the pain points, and what are people doing, and so on, right? So this is not like a one-off academic exercise here. You've been looking into this for a long time. So let's look at factory audit. So before COVID, we extracted some of the data from our IT platform, anonymized it, and sent it over to you, because you say, well, maybe there's some nice insights that we can pull out of all this data, right? So what are the main patterns that you identified?
Oh, very interesting. Appreciate getting hold of the data, Renaud, because what we want to understand is some of the relationships between different activities or different actions that buyers can take and the different outcomes when it comes to the factory audit, the product audit. And like the data is ginormous, and like your company has just been so busy in doing, 12,000 more audits in the last decade. Like we never had a chance to analyze all of them. But what we did do was we matched about 370 factory audits with the product audit. And so in other words, we just looked at the product audits that were done by factories where buyers have already asked your company to do a factory audit. So therefore we have the factory audit score outcome, and we have the product audit score outcome, and to see if there is a relationship. Does a better factory audit outcome result in a better product audit outcome? If we knew that, then that could help guide our buyers' decisions. Do they pull the trigger on a factory audit? Because what we find from your data is out of 12,000 plus product audits, your company's done less than 1,000 factory audits. So obviously buyers may not see or view the value of a factory audit, Renaud.
Yes, and that's and we discussed this before. A factory audit is sort of usually at the beginning of a relationship, right? They want to verify the supplier and the factory. What do they have a quality system? How structured, all their processes and so on. And this tends to be a one-off job, except maybe bigger companies tend to do it maybe annually and everything as a program. But most smaller companies do it just as a one-off job. Whereas for product inspections or product audits, as you mentioned, this tends to be at least once for every production batch and every shipment. So it's not so surprising that that they would do a lot more product inspections, and that was before COVID. So there were a lot of buyers who were visiting the factories themselves, maybe, or not visiting, very often not visiting the factories.
Yeah, but Renaud, you may want to just clarify with the audience and so the factory audit, I've done some factory audits for clients myself where you look at, there may be about 5 or 6 different sections that you report on in the factory audit, like the general organization and housekeeping. You've got the working environment, like the light, noise, dust. Then there's the maintenance of production equipment and facilities, and then the quality system overview. And so, across those sections, you get a real sense of the capability of the factory operational wise to actually make your product at a certain quality. Yeah.
True. It does make a lot of sense, let's say conceptually, that a factory that will tend to have a better score on a factory audit will also tend to have better production quality, right? But we never really had the data to back that up.
Yes, and I want to show some of that data, or what that data is looking like. What I mean is, first of all, in terms of when we look at the product audits, we're actually looking at different aspects of the product quality, right, Renaud?
Yes, correct.
All right.
So products,
yeah,
right.
It's
product inspection,
different from the factory audit. Yeah,
right. Is different. We just look at the products themselves, right? So let's say it's a final inspection before shipment. Okay, so which is the most common one? So we look at the average quality level. Let's say or more precisely, what is the percentage of defective units, in the total number of samples that we pick, and then we compare it to AQL limits, acceptance quality limits. I don't want to go into that, but basically most buyers will set these limits without thinking too much.
Right.
And it actually, very often they are quite loose, meaning that it allows the supplier to make even up to 4 or 5% of major defectives and still pass, with relatively high confidence on their side. So it's really kind of loose. But anyway, that's one thing, very, very common. And then they will have a specification sheet or whatever they call it, right? Some criteria for passing the inspection. So is it the right color? Is it the right size? Does it function when we press this button, and so on? And also for the packaging, for the labeling, I mean, they have requirements. And if one of these requirements is clearly not met, that also goes into a failure, right? So too many defects in proportion leads to failure.
Yeah, and depending on the product, whether it's going to be a major defect or a minor defect. Yes. So
correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
So, looking at the reports that you shared with me, the data, I was able to parse out the percentage of times minor defects occurred, the percentage of times major defects occurred. And then we looked at the overall judgment made by the auditor on the pass or fail and the AQL limits. And then we looked at the final result, which is overall the big judgment, which covers the judgment of the defects plus judgments on other aspects of the product. So it's not just the product that we are auditing, we're actually auditing the export packaging, the inner packing, and the production status. So there's other dimensions that go in. And I guess, we want to share in this podcast about what is the data saying about the incidence of pass, fail, or hold on these aspects of the product audit. And if I can share that with you, Renaud.
Well, that would be great. Yes, that would be great.
All right. So just looking at if we just start with the overall, okay, so we just start the final result. So if a buyer orders a product audit, and then what's going to come back as a final result is a pass, hold, or fail. Right. And then the buyer may say, well, look, can I have more details of the product audit? And then you'll actually go into detail about why the result is what it is. But if we looked at 368 of your audits, and we found that the overall pass for, if we look at, let's have a look. Let me pull this up.
Sure.
That's good. This is good. Here we go. All right. So if we look at the 368 audits that we analyze, and they were matched with factory audits, and we'll talk about the factory product audit relationship later. But when we look at just the product audits, on average, 3% passed in terms of the final judgment. There was 60% hold. So that's meaning that that's a report going back to the buyer to say, well, we're holding, buyer, you need to make a decision. And when you look at the report in more detail, and 38% failed. Now, if we just zip on to the judgment over the defects, which for most buyers, that's probably want to be concerned about, the major and minor defects as per the AQL limits. Like major defect, there's certain standards depending on your sample size, depending on the audit level, depending on whatever the buyer agrees to with the auditor. But generally, a limit is set for major limits. You can actually fail 2.5% of the time, and then for the standard for the minor, you can fail 4% of the time. So looking at the data with respect to those defects, we find that out of the 368, we find that 83% of the reports were within tolerance, 17% were over the major defect tolerance set for that sample. If we look at the minor defects, we find 73% within and 27% over the tolerance set for the sample. And you know, if we look at that, and this is, you know, if I just make a comment here, we may be thinking, oh, then we shouldn't be buying from China because the quality is, why? How can we have 27% or 70% over tolerance? In some ways, it's actually worse in other developing economies. So this, in some ways, is more the norm when you're actually sourcing from developing economies, Renaud.
Yes, and the samples that you analyze were predominantly in China, right?
Correct.
If we look at places like Bangladesh, India, Vietnam, it might not be higher. Okay. Now, also, let's be careful. Let's imagine we had an inspection activity in Japan. Well, the percentage might be high also if the buyer's quality standard is very, very tight, you know, very hard to reach. Okay, so there's a lot of things moving here, but let's say generally for consumer goods in general in China, yeah, this is you get to expect that some of your batches will be unacceptable, or let's say you will not be very happy to accept them. Okay, most of these batches have been accepted in the end.
I think a big point for the listeners here, Renaud, is that to just be aware of or have that discussion with the third-party auditor to understand what are the tolerance limits set for the sample that your third-party auditor is doing on your product. So are you aware of the tolerance limits? So when they come back and say, oh, there's more than 4% over, do you know what that standard is? If more than 2.5% major defect over, do you know what it is? So I think that's just a point of buyers to just be a little bit more audit aware of what has been set up at the beginning before the audit is undertaken.
Yeah, a bit more hands-on, specifying what they expect and what they request. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to move on to the factory audits, and actually this is probably just one slide that we can share, and we looked at the factory audit. If I share this, there you go. All right, so you can see this screen here, and that actually shows that we looked at, we're talking about 368 factory audits here, and that we matched with the product audits, most of them from the Eastern Seaboard of China, but
Right.
you'll see that factory audits range from less than 35 as a score. Remember what we said at the top of this podcast, that score, general organization, working environment, maintenance of production, quality system overview, and then you add that score up out of 100. So we've got a range of factory audits that are at the 35 going up to very high audit outcome of 90. So what we did statistically was to look at the mean, and the mean turned out to be about 69. So anything below 69, we saw that as a low factory audit, and anything above 69, we saw that as a relatively higher factory audit. And what we wanted to show or understand was, for those factory audits that were higher than the mean of 69, did they have a better product quality audit outcome? And that was all we were trying to do here, Renaud. And so what we do find is that if we look at the overall, if we have the overall product audit results, we find that 30% failed in the product audit outcome when we looked at the factory audit grade greater than 69. For those group of factory audits where the grade was less than 69, then we had 47% of the product audit fail. So that's a huge difference between the good and bad factory audits. That I thought, like, this is statistically significant. And if we just amplify that a little bit further, if we look at the judgment on the defects, and that is, remember what we said earlier, there are the defects, whether they meet the major defects or minor defects, and then the auditor will make a judgment overall about pass, hold, or fail. Well, if the factory audit is above 69, we find that only 22% of the judgment on defects is failed. But if the factory audit grade is less than 69, 36% were failed. Wow, yeah, just a huge difference. And it speaks a lot to the value of knowing what the factory audit grade would be for a supplier that you're contracting to make your product. And we can extrapolate that to major defects. Again, for the very good factory audit grade, there was only 8% major defects over tolerance. For the low factory audit grades, 22%. And for the minor, 17% over tolerance. But for the high factory audit grade, for the low factory audit group, 34% were over tolerance. And I think that's something that no buyer can tolerate when you have that amount of products coming off the assembly line, where the audit report comes back. You want to put the shipment into the container and get it to the market as soon as possible, but it comes back and says, well, sorry, your minor defects are over tolerance, your major defects are over tolerance. Like, you cannot afford to put that into a container and ship when that happens, Renaud.
Oh, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It can be quite costly.
Yeah.
This is an amazing relationship that you found here. It's very very clear, very clear. Yeah. Better work with better factories. I mean, everybody would say that makes sense, but this is the first time I see, data actually making the link. Get better factory that gets a better score on an objective factory audit checklist, and then it's more on average your productions would be better. This is great.
Absolutely, because generally the general advice we give to buyers and new buyers out there, you filter down. You might have 3 suppliers that you want to choose from, Renaud, and it may be the case that you spend $1,000 on doing 3 factory audits on 3 suppliers to choose the best one, Renaud.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Typically, people might, it's like a funnel, right? People might contact a lot of potential suppliers, screen them out by asking some questions by email and doing a little bit of background check and everything. And then factory audit might be on maybe the top 1, 2, 3 potential suppliers to aid in the final decision. Very common.
Yeah. So just taking that one step further, because we're intrigued about, wow, the data is so different here. And we wanted to understand, okay, this is in terms of the factory audit outcome and its relationship with the product audit outcome. And then we thought, is there some way that we can get a better insight into that relationship so the buyers may not have to spend factory audits on 3 suppliers when they're only going to choose 1 supplier? What we find 2 results, and that is this association between the factory audit grade and the product audit outcome is much, much stronger, statistically stronger, if the supplier already has a major relationship with an export customer in Europe or USA. All right. And like Renaud, you've spoken about this in the past. You know, one of the telltale signs of looking for a good supplier is, do they have an OEM relationship with a North American or a German or Japanese or a European brand name? And if they already have that and you can verify that, then that's a good sign. And the data has actually shown that out, Renaud, that when those suppliers, if they have this OEM relationship with a major customer overseas, then the association between the factory audit outcome and the product audit outcome is significantly stronger. And maybe that client could be driving both. And so that's a good thing all around. We don't need to get into statistical gymnastics about what is causing what here, but the data is very, very clear. The factory audit is it's like the canary in the coal mine, Renaud. And it's a tell. A supplier's export orientation is a good tell. Interestingly, just finishing up on the statistics, is that the association between the factory audit outcome and the product audit outcome is much weaker when, and the listeners will be interested in this, is when the product is more complex. So for example, it's a complex electronic component, it was an industrial product. If it is an automotive product, if it's a medical product, then we did not find as strong a relationship between the factory audit and the product audit outcome, because there's probably more things can go wrong in assembly that may not be able to picked up initially with the factory audit, Renaud.
Or yes, or maybe the buyer has very strict requirements sometimes, and that of course will impact, you know, the ease with which a batch will pass a product inspection. So this might murk things up, make the relationship weaker. Yeah, agreed. Yeah. It's much more likely to be the case than, let's say, for general consumer goods.
Oh, absolutely. Because what we did, we got all the products and, you know, the whole range of products in the data. And the opposite is that, yeah, for the household items, for the sports equipment items, for apparel, just everything that is much simpler and not as complex a product, the statistical relationship between the factory audit outcome, the product audit outcome is very, very strong, just amazingly strong. So I just want to, I think that's a great takeaway for the buyers. We're not trying to sell, we're not trying to ask buyers go out and buy a factory audit from Renaud, but just be aware that's another tool out there if you want to minimize your risk, especially in these times when you've got border closures and you cannot go across and really establish that relationship with your supplier, Renaud.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've had a very significant pickup in factory audit activity because, yes, a lot of buyers were maybe sending their teams to visit factories and things like that. It's been much, much harder. Basically, the takeaway from everything you just said so far is that there are 2 very interesting pieces of data, right, that have an impact, not really an impact, but sorry, that can help the buyer foresee the quality of production, right? So number 1 is the overall score of a factory audit. Yeah, that makes sense. A better factory better organized, and so with proper quality systems, will tend to churn out, acceptable product quality more often. Okay, that makes sense. And then the second thing is whether that factory is already working for a European, North American, or Australian, okay, I think you said OECD country, or let's say a developed country, right?
Oh, absolutely. They are working with in a developed market, a major customer for a developed market.
Right, at least one of their top customers is in a developed market. So these are two very interesting things.